It was a night that would be remembered for generations. Just after 2 a.m., the sky above Iran's capital, Thran, erupted in a blinding flash. Sirens wailed, but it was already too late. In a matter of minutes, American stealth bombers, some of the most advanced war machines ever built, had unleashed a wave of destruction that no one saw coming. Deep underground nuclear facilities that had been guarded for decades were obliterated. Missile factories, hidden in the shadows of the desert, vanished in a storm of fire and steel. Military command centers, once thought untouchable, were reduced to rubble. The operation was flawless, a display of American military power executed with chilling precision. By sunrise, the world was staring at a new reality. The man who had ruled Iran with an iron grip for over 30 years was gone, Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, dead in the chaos. The Middle East, already a powder keg, was now on the edge of something even more dangerous. News outlets across the globe scrambled to keep up as images of burning buildings and shattered streets flooded every screen. Social media exploded with rumors, speculation, and raw fear. Was this the beginning of World War III? Had the United States just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Inside the Pentagon, American generals watched the operation unfold in real time, their faces lit by the glow of satellite feeds and live drone footage. Every detail had been planned for months, every target chosen with ruthless calculation. This was not a random act of violence. It was a message, broadcast in the language of shock and awe. The world's most powerful nation had just demonstrated that no bunker was too deep, no regime too secure, and no warning too late. But as the dust settled over Thran, a single question echoed from Washington to London, from Moscow to Beijing. How did it come to this? The obvious answer was Iran's relentless pursuit of nuclear weapons, a threat that had haunted American presidents for decades. But beneath the headlines, there was a deeper, more complex story, one that involved secret alliances, hidden intelligence, and a chain of decisions that stretched back years. The United States hadn't stumbled into this war. It had followed a path, one paved with quiet deals and silent partners. And as the world tried to make sense of the chaos, one thing was clear: the rules had changed. The United States had just redrawn the map of power in the Middle East, and nothing would ever be the same again. On the surface, the answer to why the United States unleashed its full military might on Iran seemed simple: nuclear weapons. For years, American leaders had warned that a nuclear-armed Iran was a red line, a threat not just to the region but to the entire world. Every president from both parties had drawn that line in the sand. The world had watched as Washington issued ultimatum after ultimatum, each one more urgent than the last. The message was clear: if Iran ever crossed that line, the consequences would be catastrophic. But the truth is, the story that played out in the headlines was only half the picture. The real story, the one that shaped every decision in the White House Situation Room, was far more complicated and far more dangerous. Because while the world's attention was fixed on Iran's nuclear ambitions, something else was happening behind closed doors. American intelligence agencies were piecing together a puzzle that stretched far beyond uranium and centrifuges. They were tracking secret meetings, intercepted messages, and shadowy alliances that threatened to tip the balance of power in the Middle East forever. For years, the United States had relied on a strategy of maximum pressure, crippling sanctions, covert operations, and relentless diplomatic isolation. The goal was simple: force Iran to the negotiating table, break its will, and dismantle its nuclear program before it was too late. But Iran refused to break. Instead, it adapted, finding new ways to survive and new partners willing to help it slip through the cracks. American analysts watched in frustration as Iran's economy bent but didn't shatter, as its scientists pushed forward in secret labs, and as its leaders grew bolder with every passing year. Inside the halls of power in Washington, a sense of urgency began to build. The old playbook wasn't working. Iran was no longer just a rogue state. It was becoming the center of a web of influence that stretched from Lebanon to Yemen, from Syria to Iraq. American officials saw the fingerprints of Iranian operatives everywhere, in the funding of militant groups, in the flow of weapons across borders, in the cyber attacks that targeted American infrastructure. The threat was evolving, and so was the American response. But even as the United States ramped up its efforts, there was a growing realization that brute force alone wouldn't be enough. The world was changing. New alliances were forming in the shadows, and old enemies were finding common cause. American intelligence began to pick up whispers of back-channel deals, secret meetings in European capitals, and quiet promises made in exchange for silence. The battlefield was no longer just about bombs and missiles. It was about information, influence, and the power to shape reality itself. And so, while the world watched the drama unfold on the surface, the real game was being played in the shadows. The United States was fighting a war on two fronts, one in the open, with all the firepower and fury the world expected, and one in the dark, where the stakes were even higher and the rules were written in invisible ink. The obvious story was about nuclear weapons. The hidden story was about who would control the future of the Middle East, and whether America's grip on power would hold or finally slip away. But as the world would soon discover, the most important moves were the ones nobody saw coming. And the next chapter in this conflict would reveal just how deep the rabbit hole really went. To understand how the United States found itself at the center of the most explosive conflict of the decade, you have to rewind to a single decision that sent shockwaves through the world. In 2018, the Trump administration made a move that would change the course of history. It pulled the United States out of the Iran nuclear deal. Overnight, years of painstaking diplomacy were wiped away. The deal, which had placed international inspectors inside Iran's nuclear facilities and kept the program in check, was suddenly dead. The message from Washington was unmistakable. America was done playing by the old rules. What followed was a campaign that would come to define U.S. foreign policy for years: maximum pressure. The Treasury Department unleashed a tidal wave of sanctions, targeting everything from Iran's oil exports to its banking system. American officials promised that the economic vice would squeeze Iran until it had no choice but to surrender. The White House doubled down, rallying allies and warning adversaries that anyone doing business with Iran would pay a steep price. The world watched as the U.S. flexed its economic muscle, determined to bring the Iranian regime to its knees. But Iran didn't fold. Instead, it dug in. American intelligence agencies watched as the Iranian government found new ways to survive. Smuggling networks sprang up overnight, moving oil through shadowy middlemen and secret ports. Iranian scientists worked around the clock, pushing their nuclear program further underground, literally and figuratively. The CIA tracked encrypted messages and intercepted shipments, but the cat-and-mouse game only grew more intense. Every time the U.S. tightened the screws, Iran found a new way to slip through. Meanwhile, the cost of this economic war was being paid by ordinary Iranians. American policymakers knew that sanctions would hurt, but few predicted just how much. The value of Iran's currency collapsed. Prices for food, medicine, and fuel soared. American news outlets ran stories of families forced to choose between bread and electricity, of hospitals running out of basic supplies. The White House insisted that the pain was necessary, that it would force the regime to change course. But inside the Situation Room, some advisors began to worry. What if the pressure only made Iran more desperate? As the months turned into years, the standoff grew more dangerous. American satellites captured images of new construction at Iranian nuclear sites. Reports filtered in of advanced centrifuges spinning deep underground. The State Department issued warnings, but Iran's leaders responded with defiance. They believed that nuclear weapons were their only insurance policy against American power. The U.S. intelligence community sounded the alarm. If Iran crossed the line, the consequences would be unpredictable. By the summer of 2025, The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed what Washington had feared. Iran had breached the limits of the old deal. The news hit the White House like a thunderclap. American officials scrambled to respond, weighing options that ranged from renewed diplomacy to outright military action. The Pentagon dusted off contingency plans, and the president's advisors debated whether to strike now or wait for a better moment. The stakes couldn't have been higher. One wrong move, and the entire region could go up in flames. But as the world would soon see, the dominoes were already falling. The United States had set events in motion that no one could control. And as the crisis deepened, America's next move would determine not just the fate of Iran, but the future of the entire Middle East. The summer of 2025 was a season of secrets and sleepless nights in Washington. American intelligence agencies were on high alert, their analysts glued to satellite feeds and encrypted chatter. The warning signs were everywhere, but nothing could have prepared the world for what came next. Iran, cornered and defiant, made a move that stunned even the most seasoned U.S. officials. In a televised announcement that rippled across every major news network, Iran's leaders revealed the existence of a brand new, secret uranium enrichment site, hidden not in their own territory, but in the heart of Jerusalem. The audacity was breathtaking. For the United States, this was more than a provocation. It was a direct challenge to American power and credibility. Inside the White House, the mood shifted from tense to electric. The president's national security team convened in the Situation Room, their faces grim as they weighed the options. The CIA and NSA delivered their assessments. This was a red line, and it had been crossed in broad daylight. The Pentagon's top brass laid out the risks. Any response would have to be swift, decisive, and overwhelming. The stakes were nothing less than the balance of power in the Middle East. But the United States wasn't alone in its alarm. Israel, America's closest ally in the region, had been watching Iran's nuclear ambitions with growing dread for decades. The Israeli government, long known for its covert operations and surgical strikes, decided it was done waiting for the world to act. In June 2025, Israeli jets roared across the night sky, crossing into Iranian airspace and launching a barrage of precision strikes. The world watched in shock as the 12-day war erupted, a conflict that would leave Iran's air defenses shattered, its nuclear facilities crippled, and its military command in chaos. Yet even as Israeli forces hammered Iranian targets, the United States was already preparing for the next phase. American bombers, loaded with the most advanced bunker-busting munitions in the arsenal, were put on standby. The message from Washington was clear. If Iran retaliated, the response would be overwhelming. The president addressed the nation, calling the strikes a one-time, limited mission, a warning shot meant to force Iran back to the negotiating table. But inside the Pentagon, officials knew the truth. There was no guarantee Iran would back down. The world held its breath as the conflict escalated. American warships moved into position in the Persian Gulf, their missile batteries primed and ready. U.S. cyber teams launched a wave of digital attacks, targeting Iranian command and control networks. The CIA ramped up its covert operations, working with allies to disrupt Iranian supply lines and gather real-time intelligence. Every move was calculated, every decision weighed against the risk of all-out war. But Iran's response was anything but predictable. Instead of retreating, the regime doubled down, vowing revenge and mobilizing its allies across the region. American embassies went on high alert, and military bases from Bahrain to Qatar braced for incoming attacks. The world's most volatile region was now a tinderbox, and the United States was at the very center of the storm. As the dust settled from the initial strikes, it became clear that the breaking point had been reached. The old rules no longer applied. The United States had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. The next moves would be made in the shadows, where alliances were fragile and every decision could ignite a global firestorm. As the smoke cleared over Iran's battered cities, American officials watched a new crisis unfold, one that no missile or drone could control. The strikes had shattered more than just military targets. They had cracked the very foundation of Iranian society. Inside the White House, intelligence briefings painted a picture of a nation on the brink. The Iranian currency, already battered by years of U.S. sanctions, went into freefall. Supermarket shelves emptied overnight. The price of bread, fuel, and medicine soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. For millions of Iranians, daily life became a struggle for survival. American analysts tracked the chaos in real time. Social media feeds lit up with images of protests erupting in city after city. What began as scattered demonstrations over food shortages quickly swelled into a tidal wave of anger. Tehran, Mashhad, Isfahan. No city was spared. The world watched as the largest protests in the history of the Islamic Republic exploded onto the streets. For years, the regime had relied on fear and repression to keep the population in check. But now the dam had burst. Inside the Situation Room, U.S. officials debated their next move. Some argued that the time was right to push for regime change, to support the protesters, and finish what the airstrikes had started. Others warned that open American support could backfire, giving the regime an excuse to crack down even harder. The president's advisors weighed every option, knowing that the wrong move could turn a fragile uprising into a bloodbath. The Iranian government responded with a brutality that shocked even seasoned American intelligence officers. Security forces opened fire on crowds, and reports of mass arrests and disappearances flooded in. The regime's own officials admitted that tens of thousands had been killed in the streets, a number so staggering it sent shockwaves through Washington. The world's media broadcast the horror in real time, and the White House faced mounting pressure to act. But the United States was walking a tightrope. Every word from Washington was scrutinized, every gesture analyzed for signs of escalation. American diplomats worked around the clock, urging allies to condemn the violence and pressuring the United Nations to intervene. Behind closed doors, the CIA funneled intelligence to trusted partners, hoping to keep the protests alive without tipping the balance too far. Meanwhile, the regime's grip on power began to slip. Key military commanders defected, and rumors swirled of secret negotiations between opposition leaders and foreign governments. American satellites captured images of armored vehicles massing outside Tehran, and intercepted communications hinted at panic inside the highest levels of the Iranian government. The world held its breath, waiting to see if the regime would collapse under the weight of its own repression. But just as hope flickered on the horizon, the situation took another turn. In a desperate bid to restore order, the Iranian leadership doubled down, unleashing a wave of violence that stunned even their own supporters. The streets ran red, and the dream of a peaceful revolution faded into chaos. For American officials, it was a sobering reminder that even the most carefully planned strategies can spiral out of control. As the dust settled, one thing was clear. The United States had set events in motion that no one could predict. The collapse from within was as dangerous as any missile strike, and the next chapter of the conflict would be written not just in the skies over Iran, but in the hearts and minds of its people. While the world's cameras focused on burning streets and shattered skylines, another battle was raging, one fought in silence, far from the headlines. Deep inside the nerve centers of American intelligence, a new phase of the conflict was unfolding. This was the Shadow War, a campaign of secrets and strategy where the United States wielded its most powerful weapon: information. In the aftermath of the strikes, the CIA and NSA went into overdrive. Their analysts sifted through mountains of intercepted communications, hunting for any sign that Iran's allies might be preparing to strike back. Every encrypted message, every suspicious bank transfer, every whispered conversation in a foreign embassy was scrutinized. The stakes were sky-high. American officials knew that Iran's network of proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias in Iraq, sleeper cells scattered across the globe, could turn the conflict into a global nightmare with a single order. Inside the Pentagon, military planners worked around the clock, updating threat assessments and contingency plans. American bases across the Middle East were placed on the highest alert. Fighter jets stood ready on runways in Qatar and Bahrain, while missile defense systems scanned the skies for incoming threats. The U.S. Navy moved its carrier strike groups into position, projecting power across the Persian Gulf and sending a clear message. Any attack on American interests would be met with overwhelming force. But the real game was happening in the shadows. American cyber teams launched a barrage of digital strikes, targeting Iranian command networks and disrupting their ability to coordinate attacks. The Department of Homeland Security ramped up surveillance at home, monitoring for signs of Iranian-backed sabotage or cyber intrusions. The FBI quietly visited community leaders, warning them to be on the lookout for suspicious activity. Every agency, from the State Department to the Treasury, was mobilized in a coordinated effort to choke off Iran's ability to retaliate. Meanwhile, American diplomats fanned out across the globe, rallying allies and pressuring fence-sitters to join the campaign of isolation. In closed-door meetings at the United Nations, U.S. representatives laid out the evidence, classified intelligence, intercepted messages, satellite imagery, proving Iran's hand in regional chaos. The goal was simple: build an unbreakable coalition, one that would stand firm even as the conflict threatened to spiral out of control. Yet for all the power at America's disposal, there was a growing sense of unease in Washington. The shadow war was unpredictable, its victories invisible and its failures catastrophic. Every day brought new threats, new rumors, new risks. American officials knew that one misstep, a missed signal, a misread message could trigger a chain reaction that would engulf the world. And so, as the world watched the visible war play out on their screens, the United States fought a second, invisible battle. It was a war of nerves, of patience, of relentless vigilance. In the end, it would be these hidden moves, the ones no one saw coming, that would decide the fate of the conflict and perhaps the future of the entire region. As missiles fell and protests raged, another kind of battle was being waged in the world's most exclusive rooms, one where every handshake, every signature, and every whispered promise could tip the scales of history. For the United States, this was the diplomatic chessboard, and every move was calculated with the precision of a grandmaster. The stakes, nothing less than the legitimacy of American power and the future of the global order. In the aftermath of the strikes, the White House launched a full-scale diplomatic offensive. American envoys crisscrossed the globe, landing in European capitals, Middle Eastern palaces, and Asian power centers. The message was clear: the United States was not acting alone. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats presented allies with classified briefings, satellite images, intercepted calls, and intelligence reports that painted a chilling picture of Iran's ambitions. The goal was to forge a united front, to ensure that when the world looked for leadership, it saw America at the helm. The G7 summit became a turning point. In a secluded mountain lodge, the leaders of the world's most powerful economies gathered under the watchful eyes of American security. The president himself took center stage, laying out the case against Iran with a mix of hard evidence and hard truths. One by one, America's allies signed on to a joint statement condemning Iran's nuclear escalation and supporting the strikes. Every signature was a diplomatic victory, every endorsement a shield against international backlash. But the chessboard was crowded with more than just friends. In the halls of the United Nations, American diplomats faced a wall of skepticism and outright hostility. Russia and China, eager to undermine U.S. influence, questioned the evidence and called for restraint. Public opinion in Europe was split, with protests erupting in major cities and politicians demanding answers. The State Department worked overtime, countering misinformation and rallying support wherever it could be found. Back in Washington, the president's advisors monitored every development, aware that the diplomatic game was as volatile as the battlefield. One misstep, a leaked memo, a careless remark, could unravel months of careful planning. American intelligence agencies fed real-time updates to negotiators, helping them anticipate objections and outmaneuver rivals. The pressure was relentless, the stakes existential. Yet for all the power and prestige on display, there was an undercurrent of anxiety. The world was changing, and the old alliances were showing signs of strain. Some NATO partners hesitated, wary of being drawn into another endless conflict. Others, like Spain and Britain, refused to participate directly, forcing the United States to rely on a smaller, more committed coalition. The cracks in the alliance were subtle but real, and American officials knew that unity could not be taken for granted. Still, the United States pressed on, determined to shape the narrative and control the tempo of events. Every press conference, every diplomatic cable, every late-night phone call was part of a larger strategy, a campaign to keep America's allies close and its adversaries off balance. In the end, the diplomatic chessboard was just as treacherous as the battlefield, and the outcome would depend on the skill, patience, and resolve of America's leaders. As the world watched, the United States moved its pieces with care, knowing that one wrong move could change the course of history. The next phase of the conflict would test not just America's military might, but its ability to lead, persuade, and outmaneuver a world on the edge. As the dust settled from the initial strikes, American officials hoped the show of force would bring Iran to its senses. But in the corridors of power in Washington, a new and more unsettling reality began to take shape. The assumption had always been that Iran, battered and isolated, would choose survival over escalation. Yet, as the days passed, it became clear that the regime had no intention of backing down. Instead, the conflict began to unravel in ways that even the most seasoned U.S. strategists hadn't predicted. American intelligence agencies were the first to sound the alarm. Reports flooded in of Iranian-backed militias mobilizing across the region. Hezbollah, long considered Iran's most dangerous proxy, launched a barrage of rockets into northern Israel, igniting a new front in the conflict. In response, Israeli warplanes pounded targets in Lebanon, turning entire neighborhoods into rubble. The violence spread like wildfire, and the United States found itself drawn deeper into a regional inferno. At the same time, American military bases in the Gulf became targets. Swarms of Iranian drones and ballistic missiles streaked across the night sky, slamming into installations in Qatar and Bahrain. The Pentagon scrambled to reinforce defenses, deploying Patriot missile batteries and scrambling fighter jets to intercept incoming threats. For the first time in years, American troops faced the real possibility of direct confrontation with Iranian forces on multiple fronts. But the chaos didn't stop there. In a move that stunned U.S. officials, Iranian cyber teams launched coordinated attacks on critical infrastructure across the Middle East. 3 major data centers in the United Arab Emirates were knocked offline, disrupting internet access and crippling financial networks. American cybersecurity experts worked around the clock to contain the damage, but the message was clear. Iran's reach extended far beyond the battlefield. Inside the White House, the mood shifted from cautious optimism to grim determination. The president convened the National Security Council for emergency sessions, demanding answers and options. The CIA and NSA provided real-time updates, tracking the spread of violence and identifying new threats as they emerged. Every hour brought fresh challenges, and the pressure on American decision-makers was relentless. Meanwhile, the human cost of the conflict mounted. Civilian casualties soared in Iran, Lebanon, and across the region. Refugees poured across borders, desperate to escape the violence. American humanitarian agencies mobilized to provide aid, but the scale of the crisis threatened to overwhelm even the most robust response. News outlets broadcast images of devastation, fueling outrage and fear back home. As the situation spiraled, the United States faced a stark choice: escalate further and risk a wider war, or search for a diplomatic off-ramp before the conflict consumed the entire region. The old playbook, pressure, isolation, and limited strikes, was no longer enough. The unraveling had begun, and the world was watching to see if America could find a way to restore order before it was too late. In the end, the United States stood at a crossroads. Every decision carried enormous risks, and the next move would shape not just the outcome of the conflict, but the future of American power in the Middle East. The unraveling was underway, and there was no turning back. As the conflict spiraled out of control, the United States found itself staring down a crisis that threatened not just the Middle East, but the entire global order. In Washington, the gravity of the situation was impossible to ignore. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that serves as the world's most critical oil choke point, became the new front line. American warships patrolled the waters, their radars sweeping for threats, their crews on hair-trigger alert. Every tanker that passed through carried not just oil, but the hopes of economies from Tokyo to Berlin. The message from the Pentagon was unmistakable: any attempt by Iran to close the strait would be met with overwhelming American force. But the stakes went far beyond military might. The global economy, still reeling from years of inflation and supply chain shocks, now faced the specter of an energy crisis. Oil prices surged overnight, sending shockwaves through Wall Street and Main Street alike. American consumers watched as gas prices soared, and businesses braced for another round of economic turbulence. The White House scrambled to reassure the public, tapping into strategic reserves and rallying allies to keep the flow of energy steady. Yet, behind closed doors, officials knew that even a temporary disruption could trigger a worldwide recession. Meanwhile, the diplomatic chessboard grew even more complicated. China and Russia, both eager to expand their influence, saw opportunity in America's predicament. Beijing issued statements condemning the strikes, while quietly negotiating oil deals with Tehran. Moscow offered to mediate, but only on terms that would weaken U.S. leverage. American diplomats worked overtime to hold the Western alliance together, but cracks began to show. Spain refused to allow U.S. forces to use its bases for further operations. Britain, usually America's closest partner, stayed on the sidelines. Across Europe, public opinion turned sharply against the war, with protests erupting in major cities and politicians demanding a change in course. Inside the Situation Room, the president's advisors debated their next move. Some urged a show of strength: more strikes, more pressure, a clear demonstration that the United States would not be bullied. Others warned that escalation could backfire, drawing America into a quagmire with no clear exit. The intelligence community painted a grim picture. Iranian proxies were mobilizing across the region, and the risk of a wider war was growing by the hour. Yet for all the uncertainty, one thing was clear: the United States was still the indispensable power. American aircraft carriers dominated the seas, its satellites watched every move from orbit, and its diplomats worked the phones day and night. The world looked to Washington for leadership, even as it questioned America's judgment. The gamble was enormous. One wrong move could ignite a global catastrophe, but inaction could be just as dangerous. As the crisis deepened, the United States faced a test unlike any in recent memory. The decisions made in Washington would ripple across continents, shaping the fate of nations and the future of the world economy. The stakes had never been higher, and the American gamble was just beginning. In the heart of Washington, as the world teetered on the edge of chaos, American leaders searched desperately for a way out, a diplomatic off-ramp that could halt the spiral of violence before it became unstoppable. For decades, U.S. strategy in the Middle East had been built on a simple principle: apply enough pressure to force change, but always leave a door open for negotiation. It was a delicate balance, a high-wire act that required both strength and subtlety. But this time, the old playbook was failing. Inside the Situation Room, the president's advisors pored over every possible scenario. Could back-channel talks in Geneva or Oman bring Iran to the table? Was there a secret deal that could satisfy both sides without igniting a wider war? American diplomats reached out to European allies, hoping to revive the spirit of past negotiations. The State Department sent urgent cables to Moscow and Beijing, searching for common ground. But every effort seemed to hit a wall. Iran's leadership, wounded but unbroken, refused to back down. The regime's new hardline commanders saw compromise as weakness, and every American overture was met with defiance. Meanwhile, the Pentagon prepared for the worst. War planners updated their maps, shifting assets and drawing up new lists of targets. U.S. cyber teams worked around the clock, probing for vulnerabilities in Iran's communications and missile networks. The CIA funneled intelligence to trusted partners, hoping to disrupt Iranian plans before they could be set in motion. Every agency, from Homeland Security to the Treasury, was mobilized for a conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. But the real crisis was psychological. For the first time in years, American officials faced the possibility that there might be no way to de-escalate. The off-ramp, the carefully constructed path to peace, had vanished. The world's most powerful nation was trapped in a conflict of its own making, with no clear exit and no guarantee of victory. The pressure was immense. Every decision carried the risk of unintended consequences. Every delay allowed the situation to deteriorate further. Public opinion at home began to shift. News outlets ran stories of American families with loved ones stationed overseas, of businesses bracing for economic fallout, of communities divided over the wisdom of intervention. The president addressed the nation, promising resolve and reassurance, but the uncertainty was palpable. In Congress, lawmakers demanded answers, pressing for a strategy that could deliver both security and stability. Yet, even as the crisis deepened, there were glimmers of hope. Some American officials quietly explored new diplomatic channels, reaching out to regional powers who might be able to broker a ceasefire. Humanitarian organizations, backed by U.S. funding, rushed aid to civilians caught in the crossfire. The search for an off-ramp continued, driven by the belief that even the most intractable conflicts can be resolved with creativity and courage. But as the days turned into weeks, it became clear that the old rules no longer applied. The United States had entered uncharted territory, where every move was fraught with risk and every outcome was uncertain. The off-ramp that had once seemed so close was now a distant memory, and the world waited to see whether American leadership could find a new path to peace, or whether the conflict would become a defining tragedy of a generation. As the days dragged on and the world's attention remained fixed on the Middle East, American leaders faced a sobering reality. The conflict was evolving, and the United States was being forced to adapt in real time. The old adversaries were still in play, but the battlefield had changed. Iran's supreme leader was gone, but his successor wasted no time stepping into the void. The Revolutionary Guard, battered but unbroken, rallied its forces and signaled to allies across the region that the fight was far from over. Inside the Pentagon, the mood was tense but resolute. American intelligence agencies tracked every movement, every coded message, every shipment of weapons that crossed the region's borders. The CIA's network of informants sent urgent updates from Beirut to Baghdad, warning of new plots and shifting alliances. The NSA intercepted a surge of encrypted communications, hinting at coordinated attacks that could strike American interests anywhere from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. The message was clear: the United States could not afford to blink. Meanwhile, the White House faced mounting pressure from all sides. Allies demanded reassurance that America would not abandon them in the face of Iranian aggression. Critics at home questioned the wisdom of staying the course, warning that the conflict could drag on for years with no clear victory in sight. The president's advisors debated whether to double down on military pressure or pivot to a new diplomatic strategy. Every option carried enormous risks, and the margin for error was razor-thin. On the ground, American forces braced for the next phase. Bases across the region were fortified, with new layers of missile defense and rapid response teams on constant alert. Special operations units were deployed to undisclosed locations, ready to strike at a moment's notice. The U.S. Navy maintained a constant presence in the Strait of Hormuz, its carrier strike groups projecting power and deterring any move to choke off the world's oil supply. The message to Tehran and its proxies was unmistakable. The United States was prepared for any escalation. But the conflict was no longer just about bombs and bullets. American cyber teams waged a relentless digital war, targeting Iranian command networks and disrupting propaganda campaigns designed to sway public opinion. The State Department launched a global information offensive, countering disinformation and rallying support for the American-led coalition. Humanitarian aid, funded and coordinated by the U.S., flowed into war-torn cities, a reminder that American power could be wielded for relief as well as retribution. Yet for all its resources and resolve, the United States faced a new kind of uncertainty. The enemy was elusive, the alliances fragile, and the path to victory unclear. The world watched as America navigated a conflict that defied easy solutions, a war fought in the shadows as much as on the battlefield, where every decision could tip the balance between escalation and peace. As the sun set over Washington, one truth remained. The new face of conflict demanded new strategies, new alliances, and a level of creativity and patience that would test even the most seasoned American leaders. The next chapter was unwritten, and the world waited to see if the United States could rise to meet the challenge, or if the fires of war would burn out of control. As the world holds its breath, the United States stands at a crossroads that will define not just the outcome of this conflict, but the very legacy of American power in the 21st century. The strategies that brought America to this moment, precision strikes, relentless intelligence, and high-stakes diplomacy, have been tested like never before. Yet, as the dust settles and the headlines shift, a deeper question lingers in the halls of Washington and in the minds of millions watching from afar. What comes next? Inside the White House, the mood is one of uneasy reflection. The president's advisors gather late into the night, reviewing the chain of decisions that led to this point. Every move, every alliance, every calculated risk is dissected and debated. The lessons of history weigh heavily on their shoulders. America's unmatched military might has redrawn the map of the Middle East, but at what cost? The region is more volatile than ever, and the ripple effects are being felt from Wall Street to Main Street. American intelligence agencies continue their tireless work, tracking threats that shift and mutate with every passing hour. The CIA's analysts warn that the end of open conflict does not mean the end of danger. Sleeper cells, cyber attacks, and proxy wars remain ever-present risks. The NSA's digital warriors stay locked in a silent battle, defending American infrastructure from unseen enemies. The Pentagon's planners know that the next crisis could erupt anywhere, at any time. Meanwhile, the State Department faces the monumental task of rebuilding trust, both with America's allies and with skeptical publics around the world. The diplomatic chessboard is more complex than ever, with old alliances strained and new partnerships emerging from the chaos. American envoys work to reassure partners in Europe and the Middle East that the United States remains a reliable leader, even as critics question the wisdom of intervention and the price of global leadership. At home, the American people grapple with the consequences of war. Families await news from loved ones stationed overseas. Communities debate the meaning of sacrifice and the true cost of security. The media dissects every development, fueling a national conversation about America's role in the world. The president addresses the nation, calling for unity and resilience, but the questions remain. Has the United States done enough to secure peace? Or has it set in motion forces that cannot be controlled? In the end, the legacy of this conflict will not be written in the language of victory or defeat. It will be measured by the ability of American leaders to adapt, to learn, and to find new paths to peace in a world that grows more unpredictable by the day. The strategies that once seemed so clever and patient now face their ultimate test. Can the same creativity and resolve that built a coalition for war be harnessed to build a lasting peace? As the world watches, the United States stands at the threshold of a new era. The choices made in these critical moments will echo for generations. The story is not over. The next chapter, one of hope, uncertainty, and the relentless pursuit of stability, has yet to be written, and the world waits to see if America will lead the way or if the fires of conflict will shape a new and uncertain order.